Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Justin Barrett. He is founder and president of Blueprint 1543 and adjunct professor of psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary, where he was formerly director of the Thrive Center and chief project developer for science, theology, and religion initiatives. And today we're going to talk about his new book, together with Pamela Epstein-King, Thriving with Stone Age Minds, Evolutionary Psychology, Christian Faith, and the Quest for Human Flourishing. So, Dr. Barrett, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks, Ricardo. It's nice to be back.
Yeah. Okay, so let me first ask you, what does thriving mean, particularly when we have in mind things like Christian faith and evolutionary psychology?
Yeah, by the word thriving, I'm trying to capture the idea of a life well lived, an abundant, full, meaningful kind of life. And the way that we work it out in the book is we observe that, look, there are especially in the Western philosophical traditions, there's sort of three key features that a lot of thinkers have said constitute a thriving life, or three dimensions. One of those is, a life that's filled with positive feelings, a life that feels good. So you might think that's full of happiness, well-being, joy. So there's a life that sort of feels good, a life that sort of goes well with the environment, including social environment and everything else. So a life that produces good things. And then the third dimension is kind of a life lived, you might think lived well in terms of certain values or morals. So we often, at least in the Western tradition, have said that, just being happy isn't enough, and being happy and productive isn't enough if you do it immorally. Or something like that. That you kind of need all three dimensions to have this life. Now that's the Western philosophical tradition, and I want to glean from some of that wisdom, but then can we sort of capture that much more concisely? And at least from my perspective, working from a Christian perspective, we'd say, one way to put an umbrella around all three of those dimensions is to say a thriving life is a life that is moving toward what we are intended to be, what God has intended for us to be, to become the kind of person in the kind of communities that is sort of suiting our purpose. So in that sense, it does hang on to this idea of purpose pretty strongly. At least that's the way that I approach the word thriving. But you asked, how does that sort of relate to evolutionary psychology as well? And the reason that we've turned to evolutionary psychology as sort of a resource for thinking about thriving in the book is sort of a life that suits an organism, that sort of a life lived well by any organism. Well, that could be true of a squirrel or a dog or a oak tree or a chimpanzee or a human being. So we could think about a thriving tree or a thriving, raven or a crow, or we could think of a thriving, jellyfish. You can attach thriving to all kinds of different organisms. And my point is, at least we have the intuition then that there's something about an animal's nature that helps constrain how that particular animal is said to thrive. And so that would be true of humans too, as animals, right? So our thriving has something to do with our nature. And evolutionary studies, including evolutionary anthropology and evolutionary psychology, has something to say about human nature then. And so then there may be intellectual resources, if we could go into those sciences, to help us better understand what human thriving is, not just thriving in an abstract sense, but human thriving, and what some of the challenges might be. What are some of the obstacles standing in the way of living that kind of full, abundant, thriving life that I think we're meant to live?
Mm-hmm. So in the context of evolutionary psychology / biology, Does thriving in your mind has any relationship with the biological concept of fitness?
Yeah, good question. There is a connection with fitness, excuse me, but not as there's not a simple mapping between the two. So I wouldn't say that to thrive is to live a life that sort of enhances or maximizes your fitness. Because then we might think, well, then that means you have lots of kids and and you invest in those kids a lot so that they have lots of kids
Yeah.
and they have lots of kids, and that's pretty much it. Like, well, no, I think most of us would be unsatisfied if we just said, thriving, have a big family. You're welcome. That's the key. Uh, but if we dig into that idea of fitness a little bit, we can see that from an evolutionary perspective, those three kind of foci that I talked about, or three emphases in the Western tradition, a life that sort of feels good, a life that goes well, and then a life that is sort of done right, all of those have connections to this idea of fitness in one way or another. So the ways, the reasons that we feel good or have happiness around certain things probably has something to do with our species' evolutionary background. That is, we've evolved to respond positively to certain kinds of stimuli in our environment. Certain kinds of behaviors give us happiness. Why? Because they probably promoted fitness in our history, or prehistory, if you will, right? Doing things that then, a life on that's in sort of a life that feels good, a life sort of lived well, in terms of, in harmony with our environment, includes our social environment, as well as our sort of physical, ecological environment. But we would expect from an evolutionary perspective that doing that well in our, at least what would have been typical ancestral conditions, niches, would also be sort of met with reward systems, right? Because that would have enhanced our fitness. So my point is, if we start looking at thriving through the lenses of fitness and seeing where there are touch points, it could be informative. At least we would expect that human thriving shouldn't be running directly counter to fitness on a big population level. What do I mean by that? I mean, while there may be some exceptions that you might say, well, that person who dies as a martyr to save their country had a thriving life. You wouldn't expect that of huge populations of people, right? That it just doesn't seem right that entire societies thriving is based on them not being fit in an evolutionary sense. That would be really surprising from just an evolutionary perspective, I think. But I think also from a Christian perspective, which is the one that I'm writing from, because we wouldn't expect, if we accept that sort of God has used an evolutionary process to bring about humans, we wouldn't expect then that God turns around and expects of us to live a full life to run counter to the sort of process that he's used to bring us about. Again, there could be exceptions to this, but by and large, we would expect there to be a certain degree of harmony between ideas of fitness and thriving. Not a perfect fit, but our thriving shouldn't sort of systematically run counter to our fitness either. At least
So,
that's my current thinking on this. I'm willing to be persuaded I've got this wrong, but
yeah, sure. But now, I mean, we will get into this question, into the details of this question later on in the interview. But generally speaking, what would you say are the aspects of Christian theology that are the most important to apply to an understanding of human flourishing?
oh yeah, good. I think I think some particularly important ones are that in Christian theology, a core idea is that God has purposely created humans the theological language is created them in God's image, or sometimes it's talked about to image God. That is, to be God's representatives or his reflection in the world. And that's a pretty important theological concept Because if that's our core purpose, is to be God's sort of image in the world, his representatives, sometimes we say his stewards, in the world, then that gives us purpose. And that purpose, then, if thriving is moving toward that sort of what we're supposed to be, then it means imaging God well is a key to thriving. And then we've got other theological concepts that help unpack that, like what's known as in Christian theology as the greatest commandment: love God and love other people. So that's part of imaging God well, is to love God and love other people. Well, then that's a clue. A thriving life should be characterized by loving God and loving other people. Okay, so then we can talk about, well, what's love, and when can we do that well, and what are the obstacles to doing that well? And I guess a third little bit of theology that I think is important here is what's sometimes called the cultural mandate. So the idea of loving God well, or imaging God well, is often unpacked in the idea of this sort of original or early command that God gives to, say, Adam and Eve, we see in the book of Genesis, to then go and care for the garden. And this often gets elaborated into this idea that all of the world is God's, and humans have a responsibility to care for it, recognizing that it's not theirs but God's. And I think that perspective, and that includes the cultural parts of it, the human parts of it, but also the natural parts of it, right? That we have these sort of responsibilities to the creation to care for it well. And that ends up being reflected, I think, when in a concept that we develop a lot, which is the friction between our niche or our environment and our nature. That if we're not careful, we can create a gap between our niche and our nature that makes it harder for us to thrive. And I think that's not an accident. If we take that bit of Christian theology seriously, of no, we've got a responsibility to care for or interact with the nature around, the natural world around us, as well as the cultural world around us, as if it's not ours, but it's our responsibility that's been given to us by God, then we need to be very careful about how we mess up the environment, because it messes up our own thriving too. All right, so I guess those are the three bits of Christian theology: the sort of idea of us being created in God's image, and then that unpacking that means taking care of God's sort of creation as his representative, so that cultural mandate, and then also the great command: love God and love others.
Right. So let me just ask you this question before we continue, because I would imagine that this is a question that would very easily come to the mind of, for example, an atheist scientist. Why is it that in the book you decide to focus particularly on Christian religion? I mean, is it simply a matter of chance, the fact that, for example, you grew up with it and it is the dominant religion in the West? Or are there certain particular Christian teachings that, looking across other religions, you can't really find them there that are relevant to questions regarding human flourishing?
Yeah, good. There's sort of a pragmatic answer, and that is that, as you indicated, well, it's the perspective I live in, I operate from. It's my primary audience in some ways. Part of the motivation of the book was to introduce evolutionary psychology to Christians who might be nervous about evolutionary psychology. Look, a lot of us are nervous about evolutionary psychology, Christian or not, because evolutionary psychology sometimes has some excesses that are worrisome. But that said, I think there's a lot of value there, and it's a science that we need to do well. And Christians can't participate in that science well if they don't know what it is. And so part of the motivation of the book was to introduce Christian audiences to the idea of evolutionary psychology by ways of addressing a topic or question that matters to them. And what's that question? What is thriving? So there's that's part of the reason why there's this focus on Christian theology, because my primary audience is Christians for this book. But there is a second reason that in your question you hinted at quite rightly. And that is, I think there are resources, theological resources in the Christian and maybe other Abrahamic traditions, but I don't know them as well. So, but in at least the Christian tradition, that I don't know, feels pretty satisfying in bringing these evolutionary psychology together with the theological perspectives to say something interesting about human thriving. One of the things we often forget is that in all of the diversity of world religions, religions around the world, I should say, maybe most of them, or at least an awful lot of them, really don't care about human thriving. That's not what they're about. Okay. As my colleague Pascal Boyer has written recently about what he's termed wild religions, sort of traditional small-scale society religions are really mostly about managing misfortune, solving practical problems, anticipating the future, just real down-to-earth stuff. They're not about, well, what does it mean to live a good life? That's just not what they deal with. And so there are lots of then religions or religious practices and religious ideas about, what you should do when you have a bad crop, or how to make sure that the ancestors are going to make sure you have good babies, or whatever it is, that really don't care much about what it means to thrive in this sort of broad sense. So you almost have to focus just on the religions that care about such things. And then within those religions that care about such things, which mostly are from large-scale societies, mostly they are either these Indic ones that are sort of descended of the Hindu sort of religions and other Indian religions, or they're the Abrahamic ones, so Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and their descendants. Even within those, then you have to decide, well, which ones sort of have some of the background assumptions that fit with a scientific worldview or scientific approach. And before you can start importing sort of insights from that, right? Because if they just don't fit, then you're just kind of patching stuff together, and it's not ultimately going to be satisfying. And I actually am of the view, this may be surprising to some listeners, that Christian theology is actually a really comfortable home for bringing in scientific perspectives of this sort. So that's another reason for the emphasis on Christian theology. That's not to say there aren't other theologies that could do this, but that's how I ended up where I am.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we're going to get back to the relationship between Christian faith and science later on in the interview, but now to get more into the specifics of human nature and human flourishing. So what would you say human nature is?
Good. Human nature is complicated. It's a concept that's kind of fallen out of favor too in a lot of the sciences. I think I'll answer the question, but I need to sort of back around to it.
Sure.
Why is this even a question? Because I think a lot of researchers in anthropology and psychology, maybe especially, but also some of the other social and human sciences, have almost given up on the idea of a human nature. You'll sometimes hear people talk about a human nurture instead, or because they're trying to be clever, or just say, well, it's a bankrupt concept, because what makes humans humans is all of these environmental contingencies. Okay, the particulars of your culture or your upbringing, your social network. There is no one human nature. I think that's a bit too hasty. I think there's still intellectual purchase in thinking in terms of there are characteristic features of our species. If we understand those characteristics as arising in virtue of both our biological endowment and how that endowment interacts with typical human environments. Now, there's that fudge word in there, typical, what are typical human environments? Well, it turns out that all around the world, regardless of culture, regardless of family structure, things like that, gravity still works. Okay, I mean, gravity and basic physics still applies. Okay, well, that's pretty minimal. Well, what else still applies? Basic biology still applies. Well, okay, fine. That humans need nourishment. Okay, well, fine. Yeah, we all eat. We have to breathe. Okay. That we all had mothers. We were all born of a mother. That in general, again, typically, we are born into social groups. We're typically born into linguistic environments. We're typically born into, I said social groups, but also cultural conditions. Okay, so if we start adding up all of these typicals, what we see is, no, there is something that you can say is a characteristic human niche that interacts with typical sort of human endowment, biological inheritance, whatever you like, that produces, in most situations, a characteristic sorts of features of what it means to be human. And it's helpful not to lose track of that. Otherwise, we don't even know what a human is anymore. And I think that's just going too far to this sort of culturally relativistic kind of thing. That doesn't make sense, because there sure seems to be something that holds us all together all around the globe, that enables us to have, to relate to each other, to live with each other, to get along, to understand each other, at least in a basic kind of way. And we'll call that human nature. And we can identify what are the characteristics of that human nature, at least heuristically, by asking questions like, is a trait the kind of thing that develops relatively early with a sort of a basic fixed schedule that we just sort of see in individual humans? So like we all acquire language, barring some kind of pathology or being in an unusual environment like raised by wolves, which occasionally happens. But barring those kinds of extreme situations, by the time we're 5, we're all talking. We're all walking around too, again, barring developmental pathology. So there are certain features that you say, these are early developing. They're cross-culturally recurrent. They show up over and over again across cultures. They're not dependent on particular artifacts, objects, special things that not everybody has. So we wouldn't count things that require those, like learning to ride a bicycle. Well, not everybody has a bicycle, so that doesn't count as human nature. I'm getting these distinctions actually from philosopher Robert Macaulay, who has done a really nice job, I think. You've interviewed him, I believe.
Yes, that's right.
And he lays out a lot of these sort of heuristic sorts of rules of thumb for determining what are natural traits of a human, in his book, Why Religion is Natural and Science Isn't, an Oxford University Press title, 2011, maybe, I think it was. Great book. So we can go through and look at, is it cross-culturally recurrent? Does it arrive sort of in a way that doesn't require special cultural conditions, artifacts, training, explicit teaching? Does it seem like it's been with us for thousands of years, or is it a newcomer on the scene? These are all cues that we're dealing with something that we could call human nature. He uses the term maturationally natural. Michael Tomasello, in his book Becoming Human, also uses this term of maturation. It's the stuff we expect just by virtue of being a human and growing up that way. And that if it doesn't happen, you're probably going to seek medical attention, or you're otherwise going to be distressed as a parent if your kid is not showing these things. But I'm sensitive that I'm starting to say too much. Maybe you need to guide me here. We were talking about human nature, right?
Yeah.
Am I still on the question? Yes.
Yes, you're still on the question, and I guess that you touched on important points, like, for example, having to look cross-culturally and trying to find commonalities across virtually all human cultures, and trying to see, for example, also, I think, in human development, if things get online before infants get socialized to express them, for example, and stuff like that. So, but I would like to ask you now, because in the book you talk about the concept or the phenomenon of niche construction. So, why do you think it's important to understand thriving from an evolutionary perspective?
Right. In some ways, this is it's building on that notion that a life lived well or a thriving, flourishing life is one that somehow fits in a particular environment or context. It's in harmony with the environment. Well, you know, the biological jargon for your environment is your niche. And one of the things that's been observed a lot in recent decades about humans is that we seem to be particularly, you might say, aggressive niche constructors. The idea of niche construction is that and it applies to lots of different organisms, maybe all organisms, in that by just going through life and doing what we do, we change the environment or the niche that then our offspring have to grow up in. Okay, so when a tree, say an oak tree, drops an acorn, that acorn has to grow up not just in any old niche, but a niche that is actually in the shade of its parent tree. And not just in the shade, so that parent tree is in some way influencing the niche, but the dropped leaves change the acidity of the soil, right, and the composition of the soil. Well, that acorn then has to have mechanisms for thriving in that niche that's been constructed or changed by its parents. Beavers are another good example, right? They build dams, which then, they dam up rivers that can cause flooding. When parent beavers have been there, the environment of their offspring is different because of what the parents have done. They have niche constructed. Okay, it seems that lots of animals do this. This is a regular part of evolution, is that fitness is partly determined by that niche and how that niche has been changed by those who have come before. But humans do this in much more radical and dramatic ways than it seems that other species do, right? We can radically change the environment that our kids need to grow up in. An easy way is migration, right? So a family that starts in the tropics can move to, up to the northern latitudes, and suddenly the niche in terms of the sunlight, the angles of the sun's rays, the general sort of climate and stuff is just different than it was for the parents. It's radically different. So in that sense, it's a niche construction by just movement. But we also do it by, building a house, developing new technologies to solve problems, which then are technologies that our offspring have to acquire in order to solve those problems. Procuring different kinds of foods are dependent on the artifacts that we develop. So take a simple example of fishing. If we want to acquire fish, there are lots of ways to do it, but you got to to do it really effectively as a human being, you need certain technologies. Once you've developed those technologies, though, we tend to be, and then fish become an important part of our diet, well, then that niche has been constructed around fishing. And so now learning how to fish becomes a critical part of surviving in that niche, where it wouldn't have been if you didn't start exploiting the fish in the first place, if maybe you were herding sheep instead of. So you see, you might think the developmental environment for offspring changes depending on decisions that the parents make. That's niche construction. And like I said, lots of organisms do this. We just do it in a particularly dramatic way. So dramatic, you might think, and it can be argued that a distinctive way that humans deal with fitness challenges is through niche construction. Other organisms, you might just say, niche construction is sort of on the edges of how they deal with fitness. Genetic mutation is how they deal with it, but not for humans. For humans, you could almost argue, no, our go-to method is change the environment. And so we're actually genetically pretty stable kind of species. for something that has invaded all ecologies around the world, right? Humans live all over the world, and we've done it not by genetic diversification. We're actually very similar across the world genetically when you compare to other species that have invaded all of these different niches. Instead, we niche construct. We make clothes, we make different shelters, we come up with new technologies. So that's that idea of niche construction. And then what it's doing is providing solutions to fitness problems by changing, by in some ways changing the environment that then children are growing up in. Well, that seems like a really clever thing. It's sort of a good thing to do. It's like, well, look, it's worked for us. But it works for us because we just keep, what's the right metaphor? It's almost like we have to keep building to fix the problems that we also create.
Right.
So we niche construct so much that we just have to keep building. In order, well, and there are lots of examples of this kind of thing. One that I develop in the book because I came across it while I was reading the book, and it's based on a personal experience, was one of these embarrassing things, where so I didn't have orthodontic treatment on my mouth when I was growing up as a kid. I had sort of funky teeth. And actually, when you interviewed me last, my teeth were probably very crooked. But over the last 2 years, I've had these, Invisalign things, fixing my teeth.
Right.
And it's estimated that something like half of, say, people living in the United States need orthodontal treatment to straighten out their teeth. Well, why would half of us need to fix something structurally wrong with us? Why would our nature give us something structurally wrong? Half of us. That seems really lousy. What a terrible situation to be born into, that you're broken half the time. Well, it turns out that 150 years ago that wasn't the case. And studies have been done looking at, at skeletal kinds of remains, jaw lines, and so forth in pretty captured genetic pools, like in Scandinavia, where there hasn't been lots of migration and so forth. And today's people really are descendants of people from 150 years ago. And jaws have gotten sort of smaller and teeth have gotten more crowded over the last 150 years. Well, what's that about? At least a lead view is, well, because of the kind of processed foods that we've been eating. And they don't necessarily mean, through big fancy factories, but even just sort of bread making and things like that. And sort of not letting kids gnaw on bones and develop their jaw muscles and so forth. So we've got weak jaws because of environmental changes, agriculture and food processing, that we developed allegedly to solve fitness problems. So we solve those fitness problems, and more people are certainly eating around the world, and nutrition is much less of a problem now than it was 150 years ago, but there's a trade-off: weak jaws and crowded teeth. So now we need to fix that with orthodontists, right? So that's an example of how we fix one problem and then it creates new problems for us. Our niche, solving one problem in our niche through niche construction then creates a new problem that we need to solve through niche construction, which will no doubt create other problems that we need to solve through niche construction. And off we go. I hope, does that kind of make sense?
Yes. Let me just ask you, that kind of example you gave, it's connected with the concept of evolutionary mismatch, correct?
Yeah, well, that's right. So the idea is that most of our sort of natural endowment is tuned for an environment that at least a lot of us are not living in anymore. That's where the title of the book actually comes from, this sort of thriving with Stone-aged minds. And it's slightly provocative. Lots of people don't want to think that we have Stone-aged minds. It sounds insulting or something like that. But the reason I chose that title is it reflects an important truth, and that is most of what makes us us is really tuned to Stone Age hunter-gatherer kinds of environments. Small-scale living, with some but not lots of artifacts and special conditions. Um, and those aren't the environments we live in anymore. And so there's friction between sort of what you might think of as our nature and then our niches.
Right.
And that's a friction we have to constantly negotiate if we want to have a life that feels good, makes us happy, that we are in sort of harmony with our environment. There's going to be friction points there. And that we think about, well, what's the good and right way to live? Well, it's going to in part be a negotiation of that friction between our nature and our niches. So you're right. I mean, this is part of having this sort of endowment that's ancient, that hasn't changed a lot over the last maybe 100,000 years, certainly not over the last 10,000 years. And yet our environments have changed radically over the last 200-300 years. I think to an extent that a lot of us don't fully appreciate.
So let me ask you now, looking at the knowledge we can obtain about human thriving from evolutionary psychology on the one hand and Christianity on the other, where do you think the two of them intersect the most?
Well, so I'm of the view that, as I understand evolutionary psychology anyway, is that it actually doesn't tell us anything directly about thriving. And the reason why I say that is the concept of thriving or life lived well or what's the good life is a value-laden concept already, right? It's
Right.
in some ways it's normative in the sense of it tells us how we ought to live. Well, who gets to decide that? Who gets to decide how we ought to live? Evolutionary psychology is not about that. It's about, well, why do we have the behavioral tendencies we do? Why do we have the emotional systems that we have? Why do we think the way that we do, given the kind of animal that we are living in the environments we? It's not about how we should use that endowment to live a good life. So in that sense, I don't think evolutionary psychology tells us a lot directly about what we should do to live thriving lives. But what it does do is help us understand the problem space so that if you're coming from a value system like Christian theology or any other theology or philosophical system that wants to tell you how you ought to live, it's at least getting the contours of the problem space right. So I think that's the helpful thing about bringing the two together is that evolutionary psychology helps us look at what it means to be human in a different way. It pulls us out of the immediate here and now and says, well, probably, depending on what value system you're bringing in, probably that idea of thriving has to account for how humans have been for 10,000 years or more. Can your account of thriving do that? It probably needs to account for what humans are going to be like 10,000 years from now. Okay, so there's this time scale. It pulls you out of the here and now. And I think that's helpful because then it just shows that some of our assumptions about what it means to live a thriving life probably are misguided. Like, well, you know, maybe I grew up thinking that. Actually, I will pick on myself here. I didn't grow up thinking this, but I came to the position that for me personally, to live a thriving, full life that sort of God intended for me, I needed to be a scholar and academic. I tried other things, and I was just too nerdy for the other things. I had to go into this space, right? But what if tomorrow? Well, I mean, COVID kind of helped us see this. What if all of a sudden there is no academy?
Right.
What if all of a sudden universities shut down? Does that mean I can't live a thriving life anymore? Does that mean because the vision I had for myself was so dependent on particular cultural conditions, particular institutions, that if those conditions are gone, then I can't thrive? I can't live a meaningful, fulfilled life? Or to think about it another way, what if tomorrow what if I have a stroke and I lose my ability to communicate, at least fluently, right? Does that mean I'm done? There's no point for me to keep living because I can't live a thriving life? Well, I sure hope that's not the case. And at least I think from a Christian theological point of view, those are both intolerable options. Really, we should be thinking, no, God's sort of vision of thriving for us has got to be more flexible and more responsive to environmental contingencies than that. We need to be able to thrive even with disability. We need to be able to thrive even under sort of radically different cultural conditions. If we suddenly are impoverished for one reason or another, well, we shouldn't be dependent on material wealth in order to thrive in some important ways. I actually think that evolutionary perspective helps us sort of pull back from the particulars. And this isn't just sort of made up, because there are lots of folks that I've grown up with. There's lots of talk in church circles or non-church circles in the West, right? Just sort of regular life. We think, well, for you to thrive, you need to go to college. You need to, get married. Oh, this kid needs to, be able to play the violin. I don't know what it is, right? But there's lots of this talk, and we put a lot of pressure on young people to think those things all have to be in place for them to have a thriving, flourishing life. And they're all very particular to social and cultural conditions. And that's worrisome. An evolutionary perspective pulls back from those and says, well, wait a minute. Across all of these different cultural conditions, what's a thriving life look like? Okay, now that helps us identify what are the really important bits and what are the more negotiable kinds of things. Maybe I don't need to have to play the violin just because I'm musically inclined. Maybe going to college or university actually isn't essential. It's nice, it's good, but maybe it's not essential for a thriving life.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. That really helps us put things into perspective. So, in the book, you focus mostly on three human traits: self-control, hypersociality, and expertise acquisition. So, why do you focus on these traits? Is it because they are uniquely human, they are distinctively human, or make us distinct from other species, or because you think that perhaps these three are the three most important ones when it comes to human flourishing?
Yes, all of that.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, I think no, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I do think that these are the three most important for thinking about thriving in a new way. I also think they are the three most distinct thriving humans in a fresh perspective, or human thriving. I also think that there are three areas in which humans are markedly different than other species. Let me give just a little an analogy, because this is controversial. There are lots of my colleagues who, if they heard what I just said, they'd go, ah, and they'd scream and be very upset with me. They'd say, no, look, humans are not, especially from an evolutionary perspective, it's difference of degree, not difference of kind. Okay, so they'd say there aren't any sort of hard differences between humans and pre-humans. There had to be some sort of gradualism. So even if you're comparing us to, say, chimpanzees or bonobos, there are lots of things we have in common with them. It's not helpful to over-exaggerate sort of human distinctiveness. Fair enough, but consider this. Consider you've got two populations that are just different in a degree on, say, three traits, since we're talking about three traits. One group, they're slightly taller than the other group. They're also slightly stronger sort of in their upper body strength, ability to kind of pull themselves up. And they're just so slightly better at jumping. Now, on these three traits, jumping, ability to jump high, how tall they are, and how much they can kind of pull, are distributed across the population such that this group and this group overlap a lot on these traits. Okay? But this group's a little better on these three things than these. But it may be then that when faced with a 10-foot tall wall that everybody needs to get over, there isn't anybody in this group that has the right combination of either being able to jump high enough or be tall enough or be strong enough to pull up, or the right combination of those for anybody to get up over the wall. And in this population, there are. Either they're tall enough, they're strong enough to pull up, or they can jump, or usually some combination of those, such that some of these can get over the wall, and once they do, they can help the others pull the other people up over the wall. And then this whole population can get over the wall, and this one doesn't get over the wall. Okay? Mm-hmm. Well, it was just a difference in degree, not in kind, but the obstacles, the challenges that they face are such that these differences in degree make all the difference. Or you could think of jumping a gap too, same kind of thing. If I can long jump 4 meters or something like that, and this other person can only jump 3.5 meters, but the gap is 3 3/4 meters. Well, I get across the gap and they don't. So that difference in just degree can turn into a difference in kind. And I think that's what we see in these 3 areas, is even though humans might just be a little bit better, a little bit more hypersocial than what we see in, say, other primate species or other mammals, and maybe we're just a little better at developing at self-control, self-regulation, or maybe we're just a little better at acquiring expertise. Because we have all 3 of these and they interact with each other, we get this big bump that completely changes the way that we can navigate and negotiate the world. But how do we come up? I say we came up with these 3, Pam King and I, but also the team that we worked with. When we sat down to start this project, it was a bunch of psychological scientists bringing different kinds of perspectives from developmental psychology, social psychology, personality psychology, cognitive psychology. And really, we just sort of started going through the literature and looking at what are the different kinds of candidates that we see that people mention, that scientists go, well, this is kind of an interestingly human kind of trait. And sort of we tabulated all of these things. And when we started just listing all of these, we noticed that they kind of gathered into these 3 groups, or you could organize them under these 3 umbrella ideas of being sort of unusually self-controlled, being unusually social, and then being able to acquire expertise relevant to your particular environment because of those other 2. So that's kind of where they came from, and why I think they're particularly important.
Mm-hmm. So talking specifically about knowledge acquisition, I'm not sure if this would constitute also a case of evolutionary mismatch, but nowadays with the kind of modern education systems that we have, do you think that we're doing something wrong with them that could be improved by using evolutionary theory?
I do. I think that, I can't speak for all of the world's education systems, but those that are most common in the West that, I'm familiar with, they seem to have acquired an operating assumption that that children are a little bit like timber that you send through a mill, and you just put the settings the way you want, and then you get what you want on the other side, right? I need some, big beams. I send them through this way. I need little things. I send them through this way, and you just grind them through, and that's what you get on the other end. It's a very industrial kind of model of education. We even organize the school day often around like 1-hour blocks. Why? Mm-hmm. Why 1-hour blocks? Well, it kind of makes sense with industrial 1 hour and, kinds of like, yeah, but shouldn't we be looking at how human psychology learns and what are the right lengths of units for how our memory and attentional systems work and motivations. So that's to say, yes, I think we have some background assumptions that underlie our educational system that ignore that humans have natures. We have particular ways that we're better or worse at learning, better or worse at attending to new information, incorporating and using that. And we've kind of just ignored that and pretended that we're all just sort of bland, all-purpose information processing devices, or just sponges that you just need to, put them in there and then they soak it up. Not always do we need an evolutionary perspective to make this observation. People have been making this observation long before evolutionary psychology, but the evolutionary perspective helps us understand a little better why. Why do we have the contours in our learning? Here's an easy example is language, right? So I had the misfortune of not really being exposed to a second language, in my case to Spanish, until I was an adolescent. Because that's the way the American education system sort of generally works. Well, the scientific research suggests we're best at learning languages before we're 6 years old, certainly before we're 12 years old. It's just easier to learn languages for various reasons, some of which are debated. But it would follow that if you want people to pick up a second language, you should probably expose them to it in preschool years, before they're 6 years old, certainly before 12 years old. And it kind of makes sense from an evolutionary kind of perspective why that might be the case. Because why in the world, in ancestral environments, the circuitry, you could say, in our brains for acquiring languages and stuff, well, they need to pick out what's the right language for me to learn, and they're going to do that early in life because it's such a critical part of being part of a social environment. And whatever languages you're going to learn, that are important, you're probably going to be exposed to early. And it turns out our brain starts shutting down some of its ability to acquire, for instance, different sound discrimination very early in life. If you're not exposed to certain kinds of sounds, you can't hear them anymore. And so then you're going to have an accent the rest of your life. So when I try to speak Spanish, I will have an accent the rest of my life because I didn't learn it early enough. So there's an example of where we've got a mismatch, at least in the American system, of exposing people to a second language. But we could spin that out in all kinds of other domains too. And let alone just sort of broad structural things like one of the things I'm intrigued by. I'm captivated by some of the work of Joseph Henrich, Rob Boyd, Pete Richardson on social learning biases. Okay, they've amassed evidence that humans, including children, are sort of naturally drawn to certain kinds of, they selectively pay attention to certain kinds of people to learn certain kinds of things. And it looks like in a lot of areas, kids gravitate toward trying to learn from or imitate kids who are just a little bit, maybe 2 years older than they are, as opposed to adults. Well, if that's right, we might actually have more effective educational systems if older kids were teaching younger kids, which sounds crazy, but it's at least worth trying. Before the Industrial Revolution, right, it would have been a lot more common for having kids of all ages in a single school setting. And the older kids did teach the younger kids. And that might not only provide advantages to the younger kids because they have a more natural kind of model to learn from, but probably an advantage to the older kids in learning how to care for others, how to teach others, which are important human social skills, how to mind read the others in a way, right? To get into the head of the younger kid. Why are they not learning this? Okay, I need to figure this out. Those are important social skills, but also they're cementing what they've learned through the process of teaching. As lots of us who have been teachers know, one of the best ways to learn something is to teach it. So I think probably that shift from younger kids learning from older kids to now just adults teach kids, we probably lost something that maybe is worth reinvestigating how we might get some of that back. And that's inspired by taking this kind of evolutionary perspective on human education.
Right. So when it comes to the aspect of self-control, do you think that it is harder to exercise it in modern industrialized societies?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I'm of two minds about this. It seems that, um, which is to say, I'd like to see more evidence. But
Right.
there's reason to suspect that our self-control is, and by self-control here, I mean, I am intentionally regulating my actions, my thinking, my feeling. When I have certain feelings, I go, okay, oh, you're getting too angry. No, you don't need to be feeling angry right now. That's not the right thing to do. Or, you know what? I have to do this bit of work and I really don't want to, but I'm going to make myself do it anyway. So those kinds of mundane kinds of self-control. Is self-control getting harder in our modern societies? I think in some respects, yes. It sure looks like it. At least that's my best guess. Why might that be? Well, perhaps because we are depleting, you might think, our self-control reservoir very quickly. Okay, if you think of self-control a little bit like, I used the metaphor of a reservoir there, or a holding tank. Others have used the idea of a muscle. Your self-control muscle that needs to be exercised to get stronger, but it can also get fatigued or worn out
Right.
if you use it too much. And in our contemporary societies, we use it a lot, right? If you back to that example of sitting in school, I don't, you put kids in an environment where they're supposed to just sit there and be quiet and listen for hours at a time and ignore all these people around them. That's a very peculiar situation. That's taxing our self-control because normal people, normal animals, social animals, when they're surrounded by others of their kind, they interact with them. They don't ignore them. Right? So, okay, I'm not allowed to talk. I have to keep it. We regulate exactly when we're going to eat, when we're going to go to the bathroom. We're constantly having to control all of our regular biological urges and so forth. And is that going to be taxing? Sure, it's going to be taxing at a certain point, which means we have lots of opportunity for failure. And you might think, well, that exercises that muscle, and maybe it does. It's finding an optimum space. What we don't want is to kids or adults to be so frustrated that they just give up, right? That's the risk, is sort of a learned helplessness that no matter how hard I try, I'm going to fail. Okay, so I'm going to stop trying. So I think high human density kind of situations, you might think urbanized situations where I'm forced to follow lots of rules about how to behave, and very few of them sort of fit natural rules of behavior. Like, okay, ignore people, ignore people, ignore people. Why in the world are we ignoring each other? But that's what we do in cities, right? We just walk past people all the time. We don't go, hey, how are you? It's good to see you. We don't do that. No, keep your head down. Just go straight forward. Some places more than others, cultural variance. It's stressing our system for self-control, and it's creating lots of opportunities for failure. And I think this is one of those niche construction examples. So we have lots of failure when we get sort of too crammed together. And so what do? We create more rules, more regulations, more government to try to control all of this chaos that's sort of seething humanity. Mm-hmm. And then we have more failures, so we need more rules. And then we have more failures, so we need more rules. I'm not saying that that the solution is everybody runs wild, sort of naked, feral children everywhere or something like that. That's not what I'm suggesting. I think there's an optimum somewhere that balances exercising self-control to the extent that we build up that muscle, especially in childhood, and then keep using it in adulthood in a measured way. But we don't tax it so much that we kind of give up on it and then require government and coercion to make us behave ourselves because we've run out of self-control otherwise. So we have to constantly live under threat. We don't want that either. So I think there's a healthy balance or an optimal point somewhere in there that I think we as societies have to figure out. And I think figuring out where that optimum is going to be well informed by looking at the relevant science of, how does self-control work? When is it taxed? What are the environments it seems to work best in? How can we mimic those conditions and so forth? Mm-hmm. But I'm speculating here.
Yeah, sure. Sure, no problem. Okay, so when it comes to occupations, because people in different societies fulfill different roles, they have different occupations. Of course, I would imagine that in more traditional societies like hunter-gatherers, people would have been a little bit more of generalists than we are today in our modern industrialized societies, where we tend to be hyper-specialized in a particular field. Do you think that in those more traditional societies where people had fewer options, that it would have been easier, particularly for younger people?
I do. I think a big stressor that is a big stressor on young people in a lot of developed societies, especially the more individualistic societies where kids are told to sort of pursue their own pathway. Be true to your heart is that sort of Disney kind of mantra. And then they have to figure out where their heart is. But they're also being told not just be true to your heart or your personalized, individualized calling. They're also told that whatever their job is of the utmost importance, that it produces all the meaning in their life. So you better choose right. Well, that's an awful lot of pressure, right? Mm-hmm. Not only do you have to figure out among the thousands of options which one you're going to pick, but the one you pick determines whether you're going to have a happy, successful life. I'm like, ooh, that's a lot of pressure for a 16-year-old or 17-year-old or a 25-year-old. This is too much pressure. Instead of, yes, I think you're right that in traditional societies where your family would have given you much stronger guidance in what you're going to do, and there are many fewer options. Then that takes a lot of the we say decision paralysis away, right? It makes it a lot easier to make those decisions. But there is a second factor, and that second factor is, and what's most important isn't that job, it isn't that employment. It's the relationships, it's the community, it's not just that dad wants you to be a farmer just like he was, or a blacksmith just like he was, or a mighty hunter just like he was. It's that then you can do it together. You can continue to be part of the family business, as it were, and so that relational bonds stay strong. And that's what really matters, is those relationships. So back to that important purpose of loving other people well and being a part of your community in a functional kind of way. So I think if our young people recognize that it's not about the job in modern societies. I'm not foolish enough to think that suddenly we're only going to give kids 5 options. And okay, now you only have 5 options. Go ahead, you pick among 5. We're not going to do that. But what we can do is help kids see, but what you pick doesn't determine whether you're going to have a great life or not. And what you pick isn't just, well, does it fit you and your heart? Or whatever that is. It's not bad to ask those questions, but what your job does is it's a vehicle for you developing into the kind of person that you're called to become. Will that job help you be the best version of you? Well, there are lots of jobs that could potentially do that. So have fun with it. Find one that's going to maximize the you and go for it. That job is not your purpose. Your purpose lies beyond that. And so if you lose that job, you didn't lose your purpose. That was just a vehicle to get partway down the journey, right? And well, pick up another one. That's okay. I hope that doesn't sound too up there.
No, not at all, not at all. So before we get into some more general questions about how we can reconcile certain conflicts that arise between a scientific and a Christian worldview, uh, could you tell us about this concept of telos and what it means in Christianity and why it is relevant to understanding human flourishing?
Yeah, thanks. We use this idea of telos in the book just to try to, you can translate it into English as purpose, but think of it as kind of ultimate purpose, your direction. And, but we try to use the term so that it gets away from this idea of just being a goal that you can meet. And now I'm there. But it's more of a directional concept. The assumption being we can always keep going in that direction. So I can become better and better at loving God and loving others. I can become better and better at being the fullest version of me. I'm not going to get there in this lifetime. But my telos gives me a trajectory to move along. That's what that idea of telos is coming to. It's a God-given trajectory for a thriving life.
Okay, so now, I mean, of course, when we think about science and Christianity, there are certain conflicts that arise because they constitute different worldviews. So, for example, in this case, we're talking about evolutionary psychology and evolutionary theory. How do you think we can reconcile, for example, a purposeless uh, evolution by natural selection with a purposeful universe created by God, for example?
Yeah, good. Um, well, I think one of the things we need to be careful about is uh, building in assumptions into the science that aren't necessarily there.
Okay.
Okay, so one of those is evolutionary theory certainly talks about, say, random mutations and it looking like an unguided or purposeless process. Well, and that's fine insofar as it goes, but let's not take that sense of purposelessness to mean that the entire cosmos is purposeless. So I think we can import a conflict where there isn't one. Here's an example. If I don't know, suppose I'm making a soup or something like that, and I put all of my ingredients into a blender, and I'm going, okay, inside the blender, if you were to look at what was going on in there, it looks random, chaotic, purposeless. Because the process that I've chosen at that stage in making my soup is to mix things up in a chaotic fashion. But there's a purpose to that chaos. That chaos actually has a purpose, and that's to make great soup. It's to make sure things are blended in the right way. Likewise, you might think, oh, well, the evolutionary process is helpfully, as a scientific construct, thought of as purposeless. But that doesn't mean it is. That doesn't mean within a broader framework, it actually is purposeless. It could be that this is a very good mechanism for bringing about organisms that are very responsive to environmental contingencies, for invading all of the different kinds of ecological niches in a world, for being able to be sustainable and change and diversify over time. There may be purposes behind this, what looks locally like purposelessness, but if you zoom out, ends up there's purpose there. That claim about whether there's purpose or not, that's kind of actually, that's a philosophical or theological claim. It's not a scientific one. It's helpful in sort of doing the science to just say, okay, let's hold some of those purposes aside and just see if we assume we're going to ignore those for now and just get on with it. Then that's fine and dandy. But there isn't a necessary conflict there, I guess is what I'm saying. That's one where we can create conflict where there isn't because we've assumed that science is doing more of this sort of valued work than it's actually doing. Does that kind of make sense? Did I answer the question?
Yeah, but then let me try to be more specific and apply
Okay.
it to the context of religion. So we know from an evolutionary perspective, as you demonstrate in your books, and as people like Dr. Robert Macaulay demonstrate in his book, Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. I mean, that we have sort of a psychological predisposition to religious thinking. And
Mm.
also, we know from anthropology some of the details why different religions vary in the specific content of their beliefs, of their doctrines, etc., because they are exposed, people are exposed to different material conditions, and perhaps they have to solve different evolutionarily relevant problems. And then we also have neuroscience and the cognitive science of religion and so on. So with all of this in mind, wouldn't you say that science would explain religion away, in the sense that, okay, so we know this about religion, we know why people have faith and why they believe in different religions, so why would we need a God, an actual God, for example, or something higher than human to explain the human condition, or why people believe in this or that?
Yeah, yeah. Um, the way that I think about this is there are lots of different kinds of phenomena that the sciences are really good at explaining, including human phenomena, why we believe certain things, why we have the passions that we do, the social structures, and so forth. And many of those are relevant to what you might think of as religious systems. But coming up with a scientific or naturalistic explanation of these general tendencies and these dynamics doesn't mean that they aren't pointing at something real or valuable. And, an example I like to use is something like, so we can give a scientific account for why it is you and I both think we're talking to a minded, conscious person at this moment. But just because we can come up with an increasingly good scientific account of that, the neuroscience, the cognitive science, an evolutionary perspective, whatever level you want to work on, it doesn't mean that suddenly you and I aren't justified in believing that each other have are conscious people.
Mm-hmm.
That just doesn't follow. There are good, I think, and increasingly better scientific explanations for why it is that when I, as a parent, have my kids, my wife has a baby, and that I just love these little things. Mine aren't little anymore. I still love them. But a scientist will come and can tell me something about the neuroscience behind me feeling love toward them, give me an evolutionary account of why I think it's good and adaptive to feel love toward them. But at no point does that make me go, oh, okay, love is just an illusion, and so I don't really love them. That is a genetic fallacy. So if we assume that the natural world actually is causally efficacious and it does stuff, what we would need to explain away some of these religious claims is show that that's incompatible with the kinds of I don't know, gods or spirits or whatever that religious system is positing. Now, it might turn out that there are some fundamental incompatibilities with some worldviews. Maybe there are. The one that I know best, the Christian worldview, doesn't have that problem. It assumes that God actually works through natural processes. That's, they're well over 1,500 years of tradition in Christian theology saying that, no, this is sort of God's primary mode of acting is through natural processes. So we actually expect to see that there are natural explanations for why people might even have a tendency to believe in God, because sort of that's how God did it. And we're discovering that. So I don't see a conflict there. I think it's also the case, now you brought up sort of the diversity of religious perspectives. Well, and that's another issue I think that anyone wants to take seriously is why is it that there are certain diversities amongst people's viewpoints, and does that kind of erode our confidence in our own viewpoint? Maybe it should a little bit. It should force us to, if we see somebody else as we might say an epistemic peer, in the sense that, well, they're just as thoughtful as I am. They're just as they're just as smart as I am. And they believe differently than I do. Well, that should make me wonder, okay, where we have a point of conflict, do I need to re-examine my assumptions? I think that's fair enough. But notice that's true not just in religious domains, but all kinds of domains, political domains, moral domains, and we're actually doing sciences of those things too. But diversity doesn't mean that there isn't a common core or there aren't some absolute rights and wrongs that are in that space. And the evolutionary and cognitive and neuroscientific study of morality is one of those cases. I think we would be ill-served if we assume that because we can come up with scientific explanations for why I might think some things are just morally reprehensible or not, and we see that there's moral diversity, that then suddenly we just give up on morality altogether. I don't think we're there yet. I think we should be hesitant to go there too quickly.
Okay, great. So, just one last topic and perhaps one or two more questions.
Okay.
Do you think that religion is necessary for humans to thrive? Do you think that humans can thrive without religion?
Um, I'm going to be one of those troublesome interviewees who says, I don't like the concept religion, and so I don't like the question. Let me explain that. It's a little bit like asking, is government on the rise, and is that a problem for thriving? Like, well, what does it mean government is on the rise? I think that there are lots of different forms of cultural expression that we identify as religious. And some are more common or less common in different societies at different times. And I mentioned earlier this idea of wild religions. One of the things that Pascal Boyer and others have observed is these so-called wild religions, traditional religions, pre-large-scale society traditions, they don't go away. They just change where they show up, and they show up within these large-scale traditions. They don't really go away. So is religious expression changing? I'm much more comfortable with that question. Yeah, I think it is changing. You might say that are certain kinds of theological claims that have been common, especially in the Western world, as kind of foundational assumptions, are those disappearing from public discourse and decision making? Yeah, I think they're being downplayed. But that doesn't necessarily actually mean religion is going away. It's just we're seeing changes in what this thing looks like. And especially if you look globally, actually there are lots of parts of the world where even sort of Western traditions like Christianity are actually growing, not shrinking. Mm-hmm. So, but in the West, it's a fair enough point that the people relying on some kind of a foundational set of assumptions that come especially from the Christian tradition, but you might even say the Abrahamic traditions. Is that sort of reducing? Is that becoming less prominent? Sure. Is that a problem for society? Yeah, I think it is. And the reason why I think it is those assumptions actually have served us reasonably well as touchstones for our moral systems, for our legal systems, for our political systems, and even for our sciences. It's often not noticed, but I think it's an important point that the people who invented modern science, by and large, were living in that intellectual space. Right. They accepted a lot of the assumptions of sort of a Christian or even Islamic worldview, right? That there's a God who has ordered the cosmos such that we can perceive that order. It's not completely chaotic, but there's some order. We're the kind of animal that could perceive order, even if dimly. but we're a damaged or fallen kind of creature, so we need special methods that help check us and keep us from running away from the data and making mistakes. So we need to socially distribute this, so we check each other's mistakes and we systemize it so that we make that easier. Lots of how modern science has developed is actually built on the back of these theological assumptions. Likewise, our moral systems are built on the backs of a lot of these theological assumptions. So even in Europe, where you've got it's becoming a minority of people who identify with organized religious traditions, they still assume a lot of the values of the religious traditions. But that hasn't gone away. It's like they're riding the coattails of Christianity and saying, but we don't need it. But you're riding its coattails. I mean, you're in the wagon. You don't want the horse to keep pulling, but you're still in that wagon. So all of this to say is societies will need to come up with substitutes for this if we continue to downplay these foundational assumptions. And that's been an effort that's been going on for a couple of hundred years so far amongst intellectuals. And from my view and many others, unsuccessfully. There's not a new foundation yet. What seems to keep jumping into the gaps is actually things like complete skepticism. Oh, I guess we can't really know anything is true. Or complete value relativism. Well, your morality is as good as my morality. Well, what happens when that becomes normal is then whoever is in charge, whoever has the power, gets to decide. And so then it's all about political power. And that strikes me as a dangerous situation. So that's my long story. It's probably all wrong. No, I hope it's not wrong, but you're stretching me outside of my normal research area. But at least it seems to me that if you don't have those values that help inform these political systems or act as a counterweight to them, then all you get is the political systems. And then all kinds of atrocities can sort of run away just based on who's in power and what kind of political system you set up. And I'm not alone in that. I think there's a healthy intellectual tradition that holds that view, even amongst atheists who will acknowledge, atheism is not as strong a foundation for a lot of these things that have built our society and that we end up valuing. So that needs a lot more attention before we just go, we don't need that religion stuff. I'm like, well, be careful about what you're giving up. Now, closer to where I work in the scientific study of religion, we might also think pragmatically, and it would go this way. If religions have helped build societies, which is a common evolutionary perspective on religions, is they've helped us build these larger communities of non-kin who can trust and cooperate and so forth. If that's right, if that's kind of the natural way of solving certain kinds of social problems and cooperative problems, then getting rid of that solution too quickly could create unforeseen problems. We're back to that nature niche kind of problem, right? If our nature really has supported a particular solution to that nature niche gap, and that solution has been religious, then removing that religious solution should be done very, very cautiously, because we don't know what new problems that's going to create. At least that's my view today at 11:40 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time.
Okay, fair enough. So the book is again Thriving with Stone Age Minds, Evolutionary Psychology, Christian Faith, and the Quest for Human Flourishing. Just before we go, Dr. Barrett, would you like to mention where can people find you on the internet, and perhaps take the opportunity to talk a little bit about Blueprint 1543?
Thanks. Yeah. Yes, Ricardo. So as you mentioned at the outset, I'm the president of a new little organization called Blueprint 1543. You can find us at blueprint1543.org. And we're in the business of trying to encourage Christians to go into the sciences as fully integrated people. Bring your worldview with you. Don't leave it at the door. But also to help the sciences and especially Christian theology, but theology more broadly, have a more harmonious and cooperative kind of working relationship such that we can make progress on big questions. We do have some resources there. We've developed what we call the Psych Academy, which has a lot of resources for thinking, especially in terms of psychological science and how it might bear on theological questions. It's early days, but you could check that out. And otherwise, we also, on the website, you'll find the other kinds of resources and partnerships that we're looking to develop. Yeah, check it out. That's where you can find me. And Ricardo, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show again.
You bet.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the channel. It's thanks to people like you that it keeps running, so I will leave links in the description box for PayPal and Patreon. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlight's Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Pereira, Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimir, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Pinha, Phil Cavana, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Kian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Nirban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, and Sergio Quadriano. Thank you for all.